And with async await keyword, we basically do the same thing as we do with the then method, but in a way that is a little bit easier to read and doesn't require as much code. So a little bit more clean and elegant. So with what async await does is that we basically create a function just like this handle promise function that we've created here. So I will just create a new function that I will call get async, and then I will set this equal to an arrow function. And to make use of the async await syntax in this function, I need to make this function asynchronous, and that's where the async part of the async await keyword pair comes in. And I use the async keyword here before I create this anonymous function here by just typing it before here. So I type async here before, and now this anonymous function getAsync has become asynchronous. And what I want to do here then, so instead of calling basically fetch data here and then using this then method syntax and then checking the result in console.log the result in case it has resolved and so on, I can basically just console.log out the result of the fetch data function immediately just by doing console.log here, and then I basically write fetch data here. So what this would do now is that it would basically run the fetch data function, but without having anything, and console.log out whatever the fetch data function would return. But what the fetch data function returns is a promise, and if we don't use the then syntax, we need another way of basically handling this promise, because a promise might take time to either resolve or reject. And this is where the await keyword comes in. So what we basically do is that we just right before we invoke this or call this function here, we just write await. And what this basically does is that it creates basically this entire then method block for us with just this simple line of code. So it basically what it does is tell that before fetch data or whatever fetch data will resolve in, await for fetch data here to the fetch which returns us a promise here. Wait for fetch data to resolve before you continue on with anything else in this getAsync function here. So, for example, if I would run here console.log I can't run until fetch data is resolved. This string that I created basically sums up what it is that happens here. Since the first thing that will happen when this function is called is that it will run into this console.log, which says console.log await to log out the whatever fetch data will return. And then it will basically stop this function here until fetch data here, which contains a promise, has returned something. So until this fetch data promise here has resolved. And this will take 3 seconds, it says here. And therefore, before this has resolved, anything that follows up here can't run. And how this would basically look if I would use the then syntax instead, is that I would have to, after this had resolved, basically this either had console log the res here, or if it would have been reacted and we would have written out something went wrong, I would have to hook on an other then method here, and then would have had to, in this then method, console.log out the same string. Basically, I have to wait for promise to resolve. So all of this code basically here does the same thing, is the same thing as this code here. So this is a way more clean and easy to read way of basically working with promise-based functions. So if I would save this and then would return this here, we can see that in 3 seconds we can see that we get I have to wait for a promise to resolve, and well, forgot to call the getAsync function, so I will call that function as well. And then at the same time here, since they resolve the same promise, we should see that that this string will be printed out as well. And if I refresh this, 3 seconds, and we can see that I have to wait for promise to resolve. I have to wait for promise to resolve, and I can't run until fetch data is resolved. And since fetch data basically returns this data has been retrieved, that's why this data has been retrieved prints out twice here, since this promise is invoked by both this handle promise function here and this getAsync function here, since they both call this fetch data function, which invokes the promise. So that is what the async await keyword is. You basically need to tell JavaScript that it's an asynchronous function, and then whenever you want to deal with a function that returns a promise that has to resolve, instead of using this then chain for handling whatever you want to do after the promise resolves, you just say await, and then the promise returning function that you want to call, you just write after the await keyword, and then that tells this function that, okay, before this fetch data function that returns the promise has resolved or not, I can't continue on with writing any of the other running any of the other code that follows in this function. And this is what this chaining then methods basically does as well. So the async await keyword is another way of dealing with promises instead of the then method that belongs to the promise object, and it makes it much cleaner and a bit easier to read, and you have to write a lot less code.